Aggregate demand. So aggregate demand is a curve that shows the inverse relationship between the price level in an economy and then the amount of goods and services that consumers, government, business, and the rest of the world will buy in an economy. So in other words, it's a relationship between the price level and GDP of what people will buy. It's an inverse relationship, so that means it's a downward sloping curve. So the aggregate demand curve looks something like this. And so what it means is if the price level is high, so let's say the price level is at P1, we'd be at a point like A on the curve. And this would mean that the size of the economy then would be GDP A. Now, when this is the size of the economy, what people would be willing and able to buy. Now, if the price level was lower, then consumers and governments and businesses and the rest of the world would buy more products and services. So then that means that GDP would be larger at a point like GDPB. Now, the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping for three reasons. The first one is we call the real balances effect. So what the real balances effect is, at higher prices, our wealth isn't worth as much, so we can't buy as many things, and so we just don't buy as much. So that is, as the price level increases, right, we feel less wealthy, our money can't buy as much, therefore we just can't buy as much goods and services. And hence that helps us, this curve being downward sloping. Now, the next reason is a little more complicated, and it's called the interest rate effect. Now, what happens generally with interest rates is as the price level increases, okay, and we'll talk about this more in future videos, is the interest rate will increase. And then if the interest rate increases, then we won't take out, we're not so likely to take out loans, and so again, we won't buy as much. When again we're talking about goods and services here. So again, high prices, lower amount of consumption. Now the third reason is we call the foreign trade effect. Now keep in mind that the size of the economy is dependent on what we buy, so us as consumers, businesses, and government, but it's also on what the rest of the world buys. So if our prices are higher here in Canada than they are compared to other countries, then people will buy more, right? So the foreigners will buy more in other countries if our prices increase higher than their prices. So those are the three reasons why this thing is downward sloping. So the real balances effect. So basically if prices go up, we just can't afford to buy as much. So the interest rate effect. So if prices go up, this causes generally interest rates to go up, and we'll explain this why in a future video. And so we just can't afford to buy as much then either. So these are things like houses and cars that require loans to take out. And then the third reason is a foreign trade effect. So if prices go up in Canada, now this is important, relative to other countries, then people will buy in those other countries and will not buy in Canada. Those are the three reasons why this curve is downward. Now the price level changes. So suppose price drops from P1 to P2, then we're going to move along the aggregate demand curve. Now there's a few things though that can shift the aggregate demand curve to the right or to the left. So these are called determinants of aggregate demand. But first, if something should increase aggregate demand, then this would shift the curve to the right. So this would give us a new curve if something happens that increases aggregate demand and shifts it to the right. So we ended up at AD1. Now, if something should happen that aggregate demand decreases, so this is other than price changing, this is a determinant decreasing aggregate demand, we'd end up with an aggregate demand curve something like AD2. And so this would shift left. So these determinants of aggregate demand that shift it to the right or to the left are the things that are going to change aggregate demand, or the total of expenditures from government, consumers, businesses, and the rest of the world. So if you recall our old formula for GDP on the expenditure side, so we have GDP equals C plus I+G plus G plus Xn. If you recall from a couple of videos ago, when we looked at consumption, you'll remember that there's 5 things can increase or decrease consumption. So this is wealth, expectations, real interest rates, household debt, or taxation. So these are things that can, for instance, increase consumption and shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. Now, in the last video, we talked about the relationship between interest rates and real investment. And so we know that there's certain things that can shift our investment curve. And so these are the cost of capital, business taxes, technology changes, the stock of capital goods or the capacity, and then expectations. Now, if we look at government expenditures, so this is a choice by government. So government can choose to increase their expenditure on goods and services, which would shift the curve to the right, or they may choose to decrease expenditure on goods and services, and this would shift it to the left. So the only one we haven't looked at yet is net exports. So with net exports, there's a couple of things that determine net exports. So the first one is our exchange rate. So think of our exchange rate for the Canadian dollar is basically the price of the Canadian dollar. Okay, so if our exchange rate goes up, that means for foreign countries it's more expensive for them to buy Canadian dollars. So if I'm living in Germany and I want to purchase something from Canada, is I don't use the euro. That's the currency in Germany. What I'd use is I'd have to take my euro and buy Canadian dollars and then buy that good. So what happens is if the exchange rate increases, this means that goods in Canada become more expensive, and therefore Xn will decrease, or in other words, that will cause our aggregate demand curve to decrease. Now, the other thing that would determine how much of foreign countries buy our income is we call it income abroad. So basically this is, think of how much money is our residents in those other countries making. So again, let's suppose I'm living in Germany. If my income is going up and I'm feeling richer, then I'm going to buy more goods and services in general. And so I'm probably going to buy more goods and services from Canada. So that means net exports will go up. And then that in turn will make our aggregate demand to go up. So what we've done in the last 3 videos, and we've talked about, these are all these things, the things that influence consumption, the things that influence gross investment, government's choice to increase spending or decrease spending, and then these 2 determinants of net exports can shift this aggregate demand curve either to